Welcome to the podcast. Eric is the autobiography of my grandfather, Eric Langridge. His story opens up in central London in 1925. London, 1925. I was born in Lambeth on January 26, 1925, but my early growing-up years were spent in Kennington, SE17. We lived in a ground-floor flat in a very old house in Doddington Grove. It was a dark, foreboding building of the early Victorian era. The walls had been painted black with a bitumen paint, obviously to keep out the damp. It had white sash windows and a big old front door. The exterior walls were crumbling at its lower edges, and there were gaps of broken plaster everywhere. The walls were a favourite area for all the stray dogs to call and urinate. The whole area had a very nasty smell about it, but so did everywhere else. We didn't take much notice of this, as London was full of such slum areas, and fresh air was something we had never heard of. Like all big cities of those days, London was dreadfully polluted, and always covered with a thick fog. So thick one could get lost quite easily. We used to call them pea supers. The interior of the house was very dingy, dirty, and dark. The only lighting we had was by gaslight, and we couldn't always afford to buy the mantles, so we relied on gas flame, which added to the fumes and smell. We had 2 bedrooms, one on either side of the dining room. Then there was the kitchen, which was combined with the scullery. At the far end of the scullery was a toilet, but as I recall, it was a very unwholesome place to be with no windows in it at all. There was a worn-out lavatory pan which was smelly and very discoloured. Poor old Mum spent hours trying to keep it clean, using pints of disinfectant every time. All her hard work was to no avail. Next to it was a sort of pantry area, which in reality was an alcove. Dad had put up some shelving on which the food was kept, especially cold meat, drippings, milk, and the bread tin. It was very unsatisfactory, and by today's standards would have been condemned. There was also a stone floor which kept the place cool and dank and gave it a musty atmosphere. The next room was our dining room, which was quite large but very sparsely furnished. There was a sideboard, a table, and 4 various types of chairs. We had 2 old armchairs which were always claimed by Mum and Dad. There was also a large fireplace which had a mantelpiece above with a large ornate clock on it and various photo frames. On either side of the fireplace were a couple of wooden boxes for us to sit on, but as we boys stayed out longer playing, they were always claimed by the girls. The firewood and coal were also stored in these boxes. The room on the left of the dining room was Mum and Dad's bedroom. On the right was our bedroom, which was larger and contained a double bed and an old wooden box on which we placed our clothes. There was a wardrobe which had a large mirror. It contained our best clothes. We all slept in the double bed in a sardine fashion, 2 girls at the top and 3 boys at the bottom. There was a lot of fun and games going on, especially by us boys tickling the girls with our toes. We slept on an old horsehair mattress which was covered by a blanket. Sheets were out of the question. We had a blanket over us with several overcoats added to keep us warm. Bearing in mind the state of this building, we were not the only lively beings in that bed. We all had fleas, which was a great shame felt by Mum and Dad. Cleanliness was their main occupation, and they did everything they could to keep this dreadful building clean. 1926 was the year that Great Britain endured a nationwide strike, and from then on until the late 1930s, work became very scarce. Dad was finding it very difficult to keep in work to support the family. Every job he had only seemed to last for a few weeks at a time. I can remember him once being an attendant at a local manor place baths. These were communal centres which had a swimming pool, Turkish baths, and several bathrooms. For a few pennies, people could take a weekly bath. Soap and towels were extras. So many people brought their own. Naturally, we became regular customers and had a bath every Saturday, supervised by our dad. He also had an evening job at the local pub as a potman and cleaner, which often entailed long hours into the early morning. Part of his pay was his entitlement to any food that had been left over at the end of the day. He would bring home large lumps of beef or mutton, ham on the bone, and on the weekend, straw bags of cockles or mussels and winkles. These seafoods were usually our luxury tea on Sundays, with a pin each to wiggle out each morsel of food, all downed with bread and margarine. Economy was the order of the day for our community, and Mum was becoming quite an expert at it. All the mums had ideas for making the best of shortages and shared with each other. One of the meals Mum created was by using the ham bone. She would trim it very carefully, saving all the fat and meat particles as she went along. The pieces would be placed into a bowl along with the chopped onion. A bit of flour and drippings were mixed together and added to the meat to form a steamed pudding. The bone was boiled up to make a stock for another soup dish. The pudding was boiled in a large saucepan. Half an hour before dinner was ready, potatoes were placed into the same saucepan to complete the meal. Beef that Dad had been given was also used for one of Mum's special meals. She would place the meat on a rack in a meat pan so that it would heat through. She would then mix milk and flour together and pour that into the bottom of the pan. The meat juices would drip into it and it would form a batter pudding. Another triumph. She would also use the same batter mixture with strips of meat gleaned from the mutton bones to make her own version of toad in the hole. It would often be a very fatty meal, but we all enjoyed it. When they were in season, Mum would often buy a couple of herrings at twopence each to make another satisfying meal for us all. She would make sure they were nice big ones with plenty of meat on them and full of soft roe. Having gutted and cleaned them thoroughly, she would fry them in a bit of drippings over the open fire. The aroma was wonderful. In the meantime, she would cut large chunks of bread for each of us, and once the fish was cooked, the roes would be removed, mashed with a bit of salt and vinegar, and then spread on bread for each of us. Mum and Dad would have a herring each, and we would take turns to wipe out the pan with our remaining bread. It was absolutely delicious, and a meal we often looked forward to, but Mum was not always able to afford this. Other times we would have sandwiches which were always very inventive and relied upon whatever ingredients were available. We rarely had best butter on our bread, but there was always margarine, drippings, or even lard in the pantry. If we had to have bread and lard, it would be sprinkled with sugar to make it more palatable. Jam was a very scarce commodity. If we did have any, it would only be spread on one dry slice to place on top of the margarine slice to make a sandwich. Another nice one was a sandwich made of bread and condensed milk, very sweet. Whatever we had, we were never hungry. Mum was always able to feed us with something or other. It must have been very difficult at times and a source of great worry to her. Dad was doing his best to keep the money coming in. It was a great hardship, but whatever was served up, we were not allowed to grumble, for as Mum would say, there was always someone worse off than we were. This was quite true, for as Mum and Dad were so thrifty, there were others who were not. Every Monday was wash day. Having sent us off to school, Mum would collect and sort out all of the dirty clothes and separate them into whites and colours. The fire under the copper was lit and kept going by adding small pieces of wood which we had collected from various sources. A tin bath was placed on a table close at hand, and when the water was hot enough, it would be bailed into the bath so Mum could do the pre-wash. A handful of soda would be added to soften the water, and away Mum would scrub. Mum always wore a large rubber apron for this job, which Dad had managed to borrow from his workplace. At the top, over her chest, she would add a piece of Macintosh to avoid getting soaked. She would rub the worst areas with a bar of hard Sunlight brand soap. The copper would have been topped up, and then the pre-wash would be added to boil for half an hour. The copper lid was placed to one side, and as the clothes were boiled long enough, they would be lifted out and placed into the lid to drain. The water ran back into the copper, ready for the next lot. In the corner of the wash house was a large iron and wood mangle, which would eventually squeeze the water out, and then the clothes were rinsed in cold water and mangled again. This would go on 2 or 3 times until Mum was satisfied that the soap had been rinsed out thoroughly. If it was a fine day, the clothes would be hung outside on a line across the courtyard. More often than not, this was not possible. The smog was so bad and full of soot that the clothes would finish up worse than when she started. This meant that Dad had to tie a piece of cord across the kitchen area, and Mum would have to put the clothes up there. The ceiling was rather low, so you can imagine the condensation was extreme, and the kitchen always seemed to be dank and musty. The whole place smelled of boiled washing. Once dry, the clothes would be placed through the mangle to press them. The smaller clothes, like the girls' dresses and our shirts, would be ironed. This was a solid iron affair which would be placed on the open fire to heat up. Mum would spit on the base, and if the spit rolled off the iron immediately, then the iron was hot enough. It was a very tiring day for Mum, for as well as doing all the washing, she always had to prepare meals and do other bits of housework. Once we got home from school, there were several little jobs we could help Mum with. It was a wonderful life for us kids as we were full of energy and enjoying life to the full. Although our food may have been sparse and our clothing second-hand, we didn't know any different, and so we were quite contented with our lot. Poverty was a word never used in our house. We were in a state of living that everybody shared, and so there was nothing for us to compare with. There were times when kids at school had things that we would have liked, but we all had our favorite things, and so it never bothered us. We lived in a very cosmopolitan area, and there were children of all nationalities, but there were never any bad feelings amongst us. We had our street gangs, and there were several occasions when we had territorial street fights. There would be a bit of stone throwing and whacking with bits of wood, but we were too young to cause too much harm. Our clothes were always clean, but most of them came from a second-hand shop along the road, or the Salvation Army. The girls always had pretty dresses, and they would wear a pinafore over the dress to keep them clean. They sometimes wore shoes, but mostly they had button-up boots. I can remember Mum using a button hook to do them up. We boys had flannel vests and shorts over them. The shorts were usually cut-down trousers and reached just above the knees. They looked odd, but we didn't care. Everybody looked the same, and no one ever dared to criticize or poke fun at anyone. We all looked like a bunch of Fagin's street urchins. Our boots were quite thick and heavy, and were usually fitted with steel studs on the soles. They were great for sliding along the pavements and forever having to be reinforced with more studs, hopefully to make them last longer. We were never in a jacket, so our trouser pockets always were full of treasured bits and pieces. Woolen jerseys were the usual top wear for us, and if we felt at all chilly, then we would add another jersey, sometimes much larger, so that the sleeves would hang down over our hands. We never had gloves. There were usually better-looking clothes kept to one side for Sundays and special occasions. Mum was always very strict about our clothes, and we had to take care of them, but it was becoming more difficult to replace them. We were growing up now, and our responsibilities were being increased. We helped with more duties in the house, and we were being trusted to run errands. Our eldest brother, Don, was adopted by an aunt of ours who owned a shop in Brixton, London. They were slightly better off, so were able to dress him respectfully and assist him through school and grammar school. He went to the OTC, and later, when he joined the army, he became an officer. In the meantime, we soldiered on and began to make our lives a bit more interesting. We were beginning to wander further afield. I was the oldest boy now, so I was put in charge of my younger brother, Lionel. Dad had made us a box cart on 2 wheels, and I used to push Lionel around in it. Later on, it was put to better use. The council roadmen were removing the wooden blocks from between the tram lines, and the public were allowed to collect the blocks for firewood. As we were the only kids in our street with a cart, we were in great demand. When we had satisfied ourselves that there was enough stacked in our yard for the copper and open fire, we would look after our neighbours. The blocks were tarred and burned fiercely, which probably added to the pollution and smog situation. We would fill our little cart with as many pieces of wood as we could manage, and the people would give us 2 or 3 pence a load. All the money went to Mum. There were quite a few street markets in and around Walworth Road, which we visited regularly for orange boxes and vegetable crates, all adding to our store of firewood. Sometimes we didn't bother with wood, but would ask the storeholder for outside cabbage and cauliflower leaves, also bruised fruit and vegetables. Mum would sort it all over and share with her neighbours. Nothing was wasted. On Saturdays, we always made a special trip to the Kennington Gasworks to get a cartload of coke. Not the drink, but coal that had been burnt to extract the gas. This would burn brightly in our open fire with a nice warm glow. Most people brought their own sacks and would use a pram or pushchair to cart it home. It cost about 2 pence a load and was greatly sought after. Our neighbours would give us an extra penny for fetching it for them. We had quite a little business going, and we were always looking for other money-making ideas, such as collecting horse manure, manure and selling it to the posher houses that had gardens. We were quite proud at being able to help Mum and Dad with our extra pennies. There was a baker's shop just up the road, and on Wednesdays and Saturdays, the baker used to sell surplus bread at a halfpenny each. So I used to queue for 2 loaves. He would also sell stale cakes at a penny a bag. The best time to get those were late Saturday afternoons, when he would fill a bag for very little money. The shop was closed Sundays, but as the ovens were still hot, he would offer to cook Sunday lunches for the women, thus saving them their precious fuel. The charge was 2p. Our milk was delivered by a milkman who delivered the streets with a horse and cart. The cart was a 2-wheeled affair which looked much like a Roman chariot. The back was open, so he could just step on and off. There were 2 huge churns on board which were spotlessly clean and had 2 gleaming brass bands about them. He had 2 measures, a pint and a half-pint, each having a handle enabling them to be hung around the top of the churn. We would run out with our jug, and if we only wanted a pennyworth, he would dole out what he thought was a fair amount for the price. He was a very nice man to us, and if we were polite and respectful to him, our milk would be increased by a little drop more. The apron he wore was blue and white, and usually smelled of stale milk, probably due to all of the splashing. There were times when we might have missed the milkman, but for the sake of a little walk up the road, we never went without. We would take our jug and go up to the dairy shop. This was a spotless building that had been tiled throughout with pictures of cows and sheep and farmland. It had a marvelous marble counter across the shop on which was a huge china bowl of fresh milk. The combination of the china and marble kept it very cool. It was usually covered by a piece of muslin to keep out the flies. We could also buy butter from the dairy, especially as a Sunday treat, which would be amount to a couple of ounces. On the counter would be a huge block of butter covered with a spotless white cloth. The shopkeeper would take off a portion of butter and weigh it, before patting it into a shape with 2 paddles that were kept in a bowl of cold water. It was fascinating to watch him at work. Nearby was our little grocer shop, which sold everything from bacon to candles and paraffin. To us children, it was like Aladdin's cave, full of interesting items such as paraffin cans, tin baths and oil lamps, all hanging from the ceiling. There were bundles of firewood and boxes of candles on the counter. The smells were wonderful, ranging from the tarred firewood, mothballs, carbolic soap, and camphor oil. We used to run errands to this shop regularly, either for Mum or for our neighbours, for candles at a penny each or even a jug of vinegar. We were known to sip the vinegar on the way home and add water when we got indoors, so Mum wouldn't know. To one side of the shop was a whitewashed room with shelves on which were stacked cheese, hams, and sides of bacon. He would carve these commodities by hand and was sometimes very generous, especially when he got to the ends of the meats. He had a system whereby each of his customers had the opportunity to purchase the oddments for a few coppers, and they often made very tasty meals. Cheese was a delicacy that Mum couldn't always afford, but the grocer man also had a system of offering the outer rinds to the people. We had some, and Mum would very carefully scrape as much cheese as possible off the rind, enough to make sandwiches or perhaps a pudding. Mum used to buy blocks of carbolic soap from this shop, also bags of soda crystal. She would buy a penny whiten brick, which was used for whitening the front doorstep and window ledges, a favourite place for us kids to sit. You could buy blue bags from here, which were used to whiten the girls' petticoats and our Sunday shirts. Robin's starch was purchased for doing the ironing. Little things like matches, hair grips, safety pins, and studs for our shoes were also available. It was a wonderful little shop. Another shop that had wonderful smells was our local fish and chip shop. When we were hungry, the smell drew us along like a magnet. It was for dinners like this that Mum used to spend all the extra pennies we had earned. You could get a halfpenny worth of fish and a halfpenny worth of chips to have a lovely meal, all wrapped up in a piece of newspaper. We used to collect and save newspaper, and when we had enough, we would take them to the shop and the man would give us a bag of cracklings, which were crisp pieces of batter or even fish, absolutely delicious. We could get pickled gherkins or eggs for a halfpenny each, or even a cup of mushy peas. These were shops that were quite near home, but as Lionel and I wandered, there were yet more interesting shops around the streets and markets. There were dozens of stalls along the Walworth Road, selling everything you could imagine. The methods of selling and shouting their wares were quite an eye-opener. One of the most amusing was the man that sold the chinaware. His workbench was an upturned tea chest on which he had a tin tray, and when this was loaded with china or glassware, he would bang a wooden mallet on the tea chest to make everything rattle and bounce together, never breaking anything. He would also toss plates or bowls in the air without breaking them. And as we moved along the street, there were people who seemed to be loitering in shop doorways, but who in fact were trying to sell their meager possessions, such as a wedding ring or pocket watches. Even children were doing it, probably placed there by their parents to arouse a sympathetic sale for a pair of shoes or a piece of clothing. Things really were that bad, and people were desperate. One of the stalls we always stopped at was the man who sold drinks. We could get lemon or orange drinks but my favorite was a glass of hot sarsaparilla for a halfpenny. Off we would wander again, and this time we would stop at the wet fish stall, where we would stand wide-eyed and open-mouthed at the sight of things on view. All the fish we had seen were pieces wrapped in batter, but here were the real things, and some of them looked really weird. Sometimes the man would hold up a huge fish for sale, and whilst doing so, would wave it about and sometimes threaten to throw it at us. There was also a deep pan of live eels writhing about, and as people chose them, he would take them out one by one and chop them up. All the pieces were jumping about and made us feel quite sick, so we moved on. We would continue to wander until eventually our tummies reminded us it was dinner time. If we had any money between us, we would go into the pie and eel shop for a pennyworth of mash, potatoes, and gravy. If we were lucky, the man would give us bits of pie or fish that had broken during cooking. It was all very nourishing, and we left the place feeling quite full. Often we would go again, just ambling along with not a care in the world. We had no sense of distance or time, and so that eventually we ended up being completely lost. Naturally, we would ask people where we were, and more often than not, Lionel would be crying, so that people took pity on us and took us to the nearest underground train and paid for our ticket back to Kennington and home. Our mum and dad were driven to distraction, wondering where we had been. I would usually get a good hide-in and made to promise we wouldn't do it again. It wasn't that we were naughty or defiant, but that when we wandered we had no idea of how far we had gone. So for the next few days we were confined to our own street area and not allowed to go any further than the shops, and we soon settled down and started playing games with our mates. There were several games we had learned. One of the favourites was flicking fag cards. The idea was to place the card up against the wall at an angle, and then each one of us would take turns to flick a card at them to knock them down. The winner takes all. It often became very competitive and often led to squabbles. Another good game was with our whip and tops. We could buy them for a few pennies and they kept us going for a long time. The top would be stood up in a hole or crack between the pavements. The whipcord would be wrapped around the top, and with a sharp tug, the top would spin and lift off down the road. The winner was the one who got to the end of the road first. If there were no mates to play with, we would join the girls in a game of hopscotch, but it was not very often, as the girls always said that the boys cheated. Then they would be playing at skipping rope, and we would tease them and spoil their game by pushing the girl who was turning the rope. It often ended in a good chasing game. Another source of good fun was swinging on the lampposts. Each post had a bar placed across the top for the lamp lighter to rest his ladder. We would throw a length of rope over the bar and pull on it until the ends met. We would then swing back and forth on the rope. What was even more daring was to run and swing out wide around the post, being careful not to crash into the post itself. This game would go on well into the evening, and if we were not careful, we would be caught by the lamplighter. He would tell us off, but we usually ended up following him as he went about his work. He carried a very long pole with a hook in the end. This would be placed into a chain which was hanging from the lamp. As he pulled it, the lamp lit up. He would repeat his journey in the morning, only this time he would push against the chain bar and put out the light. At other times during the day he carried a ladder and would clean the glass and gas mantles. We would be out amusing ourselves like this until quite late in the day, sometimes going without our tea. When we did get in, Mum would always cut a thick slice of bread and drippings with a mug of cocoa, after which we would wash and soon be tucked up into bed.